In today's episode, we're going to pull apart the education system. I'm going to ask whether or not the way that we educate our children is still fit for purpose. The education system that we rely on today was designed over 100 years ago, and we're now in a position where services are stretched, underfunded, and lots of kids are falling through the cracks. With all of the new information that we've discovered in recent years about how kids' brains work and the best way to get the best out of them, is it time that we had a major shift in the way that the education system is designed? So in this episode, I'm going to give you a brief history of the education system in the UK, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience with the education system, both from my point of view and from having a child that's now in year 2 in primary school. I'm going to suggest some of the potential problems with the modern system and then challenge what we could potentially do instead as a new approach. I think this one's really important because education shapes society. It has long-term impact on our kids and the way that they develop into adults. It shapes the workforce for the future generation and different opportunities and innovations that come out of the next generation based on the education system that they grew up in. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Thinking Differently, a podcast designed to take an idea, pull it apart, and challenge the way that we think about it. I'm your host, Andy Franklin, and I'll be your guide through this sometimes wandering journey of exploration, which will hopefully leave you with more questions than answers and a lot to think about. So, as with all of my podcast episodes, I am only trying to bring this subject into our awareness so we can play with it, so we can notice certain things about it, so we can investigate those things, and we can have a deeper understanding of the drivers behind those and potentially challenge the way that we think about them. All of the opinions are my own. I am not saying for a second that I am correct or that what I'm saying is the absolute truth. It is just my opinion. And I also hope that at some point in the future, my opinion may change. I like to think that I have a growth mindset. So when given new information, I want to incorporate that into my worldview and potentially have a different view of the same thing in the future. I'm aware that this is a really emotive subject. And it's also very nuanced and subjective, depending on your personal experience of the schooling system and the way that you felt during it and then afterwards about the education that you received. And finally, I'm not here to give you your answers. I am hoping that my exploration of this topic can be a catalyst for you challenging your own thinking and working out what's right for you and what feels right for you moving forwards. So let's start with a really brief history of the UK education system. So in the medieval periods, most education was done by the monastery, and it was really only reserved for the upper classes and for people who had the opportunity to spend time learning things. In the 19th century, a set of reforms came in which enforced that all elementary school age children received an education. And that was children aged 5 to 13. And this was laying the foundation for the mass education system. There was then a second reform at the beginning of the 1900s, so 1902, that came in to give the local authorities power to create a secondary education for all children aged older. In the mid-1900s, there was then a divide of the three schooling systems in secondary education, from grammar schools, which were mainly academic, modern schools, which were kind of generalist schools, and then technical schools, which were vocational schools. Then in the 60s, there was another educational reform that brought in comprehensive schools, which were meant to be a more general view of everything and give the students a broader education. And in 1988, the national curriculum was created, which created standardized testing across all levels and was aimed to raise the standards of every school as opposed to having wide amounts of variation between the schools. And I think that's basically where we're up to. There are some academies that are forming now which are potentially more independent but still state funded. I haven't had a lot of exposure to those. I don't really understand a lot about how they work or how they differ from the national curriculum. But I would say even in those instances, my assumption is that they still vaguely follow the national curriculum. They still aim for the standardized tests, which are at the moment GCSEs and A levels. GCSEs are taken at 16 years old, A levels are taken at 18 years old, and then based on your A level results, you then go off to university if you choose to. So my personal experience is twofold. One, I have one of my boys who is now 6 years old. So he's in year 2 of primary school. And so I've had a lot of exposure in the last 3 years to the modern schooling system. And then I obviously have my own personal experience, which was a good 30 odd years ago, where I have obviously processed a lot of that education system, but I also, a lot of the way that I think was formed by the education system that I went through as a child. So I think generally the school that we picked for my eldest is a really supportive and encouraging school. We definitely, when we were looking around all of the schools for options, we picked one that felt more like they were going to focus on emotional aptitude as opposed to just academic rigor. There was one outstanding school that I remember we went to see, which was teaching primary school, like 5-year-olds Chinese. And it was ticking all of the boxes and it was getting the outstanding Ofsted report. But for us, it was a very cold and non-compassionate place to be. The children were almost like little robots. And although the head teacher made a very good presentation for her school, it didn't feel like a warm and supportive place to be. The school that we chose is really supportive with the kids. They're constantly kind of bending and understanding the way that each child has their own needs. And there's been several days where I have seen other children at the school gates, or in fact, my own child several times, who didn't want to wear the school uniform, didn't want to wear these kind of shoes, or was really struggling to get into school. And they've been so supportive and they've been so encouraging about, as long as the child is in school, all of the rest doesn't matter. There's been days that my son has gone in a PE kit rather than his school uniform just because it was more comfortable. And I think they're really attuned to what the children need. But even in that kind of school environment, which I think is amazing, they are still within the confines of the education system. They are still bound by the demands of the national curriculum and the funding needs and the expectations. I know next year in year 3, my child gets his first official academic assessment. So like SATs. The idea for me of sitting a child down at the age of 7 and making them do tests is a little bit bizarre. But that's what the national curriculum dictates. That's what they have to do, regardless of whether or not that particular school wants to do it. I think my experience of school was a ropey one. I definitely found some subjects really easy and others I really struggled. I think maths for me just made sense in my head. I was always really good at maths, especially kind of working things out and logic maths, so mental arithmetic and things like that, as opposed to in the later years with A levels, where it was more about applying formulas rather than being able to work things out yourself. Whereas English, I struggled more with reading, and there was a lot of social pressure around reading and performance in class. I didn't have a particular aptitude for sports, so that meant that I didn't really fit in with the sports crowd, although I would play football every lunchtime in a kind of more playful way. And I really loved all of the creative subjects, so art, music, drama, things like that. Again, there was something that really worked for my brain in academics, in those kind of creative subjects. I remember being able to just learn lines after hearing them a couple of times in school plays and musicals, whereas reading text that I'd never seen before off a page was really challenging. And then there was the social aspect of my school life where I definitely felt like there was a big pressure on not being too smart, not being too clever, and not standing out in any way. You almost had to prove yourself to be average so you weren't potentially a target for anyone that wanted to ostracize you from a group. And I think that definitely still impacts me today. I talk about that in therapy quite a bit. This idea of demonstrating my skill for fear that it looks like I'm showing off. And so I don't think a lot of those areas that I really cared about were nurtured within the education system. And that's not me placing any blame on the school that I went to or the teachers or even the people running the process. I think it was the structure of the education system that means that naturally people can't focus and give each child the nurturing that they need in order to really develop and excel in the areas that they care about. And so I only really discovered my love of learning new things after I left the education system, when I discovered that there were multiple ways of learning things that I hadn't ever been shown, that part of the way that I learn things is actually like taking them apart and playing with them like a mechanic. I need to take all the bits apart and go, oh, I wonder what this one does, and shake it a bit and wiggle it and put it back in a different place and see if it still works in order to truly understand something. And so I guess my experience of school was that the school and the education system weren't built for the way that I liked to understand the world. And so I felt very much like I didn't fit into the schooling system that existed. And I hear that a lot when you talk to other people. There's a huge amount of people that I speak to who felt like the education system and the way that it was built wasn't built for them, that they somehow didn't fit in, that it didn't work for the way that they needed to work when they were a child. And a lot of people carry a lot of resentment and legacy of issues with self-worth and things based on those things that the education system created within them. And then there's also, from my experience of watching my son, this deep desire within kids to please their teachers, which sometimes bypasses their natural urge for curiosity and exploration. What I've noticed is my son is incredibly curious, will ask all kinds of really interesting questions, but if it's a choice for him between pleasing the teacher by sitting still and doing exactly what he's told, and challenging the ideas and questioning things in a way that would deepen his understanding, he's always going to go for the former, which I think is part of the problem, but could also potentially be part of the solution. So, not to hammer it home, but I did make a list of all of the things that I think are problems with the current system that would need to be addressed. It's quite a big list, but I'm going to read it to you. So I think the problems as I see it are how things are taught, why things are taught. So that means what you're actually teaching to the children. So the curriculum and the things that are seen as important and the things that are seen as less important. Where things are taught, so the environment of the classroom or anywhere else that they might be teaching. What is not taught, so the things that have never been included in the curriculum that could be really important. What our bodies need on every day and what the kids' bodies need, and then what our minds need in order to get the best out of ourselves. Different learning styles. Learning styles is something that kind of was created and then somewhat debunked, but People naturally have a preference for the way that they're learning, although there is some evidence now that learning in a style which is not your preference can actually help solidify memory, because it adds an extra layer of friction that means that things are more difficult, so you're more likely to retain the information. But still, the ability to understand a child and the way that they need to understand a subject in order to really internalize the key messages of that subject and not just remember something to repeat it. So that brings me on to the idea of a deeper level of learning. So a deeper understanding within the learning idea rather than just memorizing things in order to repeat them and then forget about them and never use them again. Understanding which parts of education are still applicable for modern society. So, for example, there's a lot of education which revolves around history. There is some benefit of learning history if there is an understanding of why we are learning that kind of history. I think there's a gap with how to learn. So the teachers are teaching children what they should learn and showing them what they need to retain, but they're not really teaching them how to learn. And if you learn how to learn, then everything else is more accessible to you moving forwards. I think there's also a challenge with how to retain information for different purposes. So whether or not you're retaining it just to regurgitate it, or whether you're retaining it to use it in a critical thinking way and apply the same logics to other areas. And then also along those lines, the idea that there's a different way of learning knowledge in order to pass a test compared to how to apply it to your life moving forwards. And I think education should be more focused towards the second one, because that's the one that's going to be more usable, more productive for a child as they move into being an adult, being able to use the knowledge they have and have an understanding of that rather than it just being knowledge to be repeated. I think, especially in the modern age where knowledge is readily available at your fingertips, I don't need to know what the capital of Belarus is anymore because I can just look it up. Whereas knowing how to apply pieces of information and critical thinking are much more important. It feels to me like the education system was designed with an adult-focused approach, whereas now in modern parenting and in understanding children better, we very much take a more child-focused approach. And what I mean by that is that the idea of schooling was to create little adults, and it was designed by adults with adults in mind. They were trying to replicate the information that they had in children, so those children had that information, rather than thinking about the way that children think about the world and building an education system around that with children in mind. I think there's also an idea of what we're creating our children to be. So we are currently teaching them to sit down and be quiet and follow orders, which is what works really well in an old school capitalist society where the ideal worker just sat down and followed a script and didn't do any thinking for themselves. Whereas the modern world now works very differently. You have to be able to do critical thinking. You have to be able to compare and analyze and take insights from other information and apply them to the thing that you're thinking about within your work life. As I've touched on already, I think it overlooks a lot of the development needs from a physical point of view with children. Children need to be active, they need to be moving. And even a lot of adults, you'll probably notice that I'm standing up through all of these podcasts because my body tells me that I need to move around. And so the idea of trying to think and articulate my points while sitting down just doesn't work for me. In the same way, for children, some of them will have different energy levels and they may actually learn better if movement is incorporated into the learning style as opposed to being separate and something that you do within certain blocks of time at school. Both of my parents were teachers. My mum taught food education and then went into adult education, and my dad worked in a special education school. And I always remember he was trying to teach me spellings on one occasion, and he had me jumping between the little white squares of our 1980s lino floored kitchen. And each of the little squares had a different spelling on. And I retained those spellings so much easier from having a physical aspect to the learning process as opposed to just sitting down and staring at some spellings and trying to retain that information. I think there's a challenge for me with sidelining the arts and creative pursuits and sports, which are considered non-academic. I think potentially part of that may be caused by the fact that the policy makers are the ones who did quite well academically. But there was this lovely quote that I heard in the Hidden 20% podcast. The comedian Marcus Bridgestock suggested that every child should leave school feeling like they're good at least one thing. And I think with the focus on academic rather than other subjects, it can potentially leave kids feeling isolated and not good at anything because they don't fit into that box of being good academically. I think class sizes have a big impact as well on the ability to teach children in the right way. So when there is a single teacher or a teacher and a TA trying to look after 30 children, it's almost impossible to suggest that they would be able to nurture each child to their full potential. And I wonder where that class size came from. It's probably something to do with funding and the maximum number of children you can get into a classroom for the minimum spend. But then there's also this idea in one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, and I can't remember which one it is, where it was talking about actually children do the best in class sizes of around 20. So it's not proportional that the less number of children, the better they do, because there is something about learning with your peers and collaborative groups of working and learning, which is beneficial for children as well. But larger class sizes definitely lead to less ability to create individual lesson plans and lean into a child's natural way of learning a subject. I think priorities of what's learned probably need investigating a little. So there's a very heavy emphasis on maths and English in the UK. I think there is a benefit of that. Obviously, maths and English is critical to life skills, but possibly not all of the maths and English curriculum is as relevant as it once was. I think the ability to know the difference between an adjective and a noun may not be as relevant as it might have been 50 years ago. Whereas understanding how to do basic mental arithmetic, so you know how much change you're meant to get in a shop if anybody uses cash anymore. But being able to do basic finances to make sure that you're not overspending on a month is a real life skill that is really important moving forwards and could potentially leave you as an adult in a really vulnerable position if you didn't have those core skills. But there are also other life skills which are, I would say, in our modern society, just as applicable and just as important, which are not taught at all. So understanding nutrition is something which is only very vaguely touched upon within the schooling system. And having a much deeper understanding of that would make everybody a lot healthier. There's mindfulness and introspection and emotional regulation and understanding how your emotions are created and how to manage them in a safe and expressive way is something which I don't think is in the curriculum at all. Or if it is, it's so tiny in relation to some of the topics which are maybe less relevant in today's society, like history or geography. And then, as I said already, there's this idea of memorizing a value of a thing in order to regurgitate it has a much higher emphasis than critical thinking, problem solving, and analysis, which again is a really important life skill to be able to decide what you want to do in life or what you want to do on any given day or what you should be able to prioritize or how to think about a problem in order to solve it in a new way. I think there's also the wealth gap in education. So all of these things that I'm talking about are potentially addressed, but are addressed within the private schooling system as opposed to the public schooling system. It creates a hierarchy of education which should never be part of a child's ability to thrive. I also wonder whether it's very difficult to address any of these issues, even if the teachers and policymakers are aware of them, because every time we're trying to just bolt new solutions onto an existing framework that doesn't work, it's almost like having a bungalow and then trying to build little extra rooms onto that bungalow without thinking about the structure of the house as a whole. You'd end up with a rabbit warren of different rooms, and you could only get to the second bedroom if you go through the first bedroom and also a bathroom on your way. That kind of idea that what we probably should have done is designed the structure as a whole, and if it's not fit for purpose now, it's a lot more difficult for people to say, let's rip the whole thing down and start again, than it is to try and make small incremental changes. But those incremental changes never really get to the core of where the issues are because they're all still working to try and bolt on to an existing framework. Now, as you can probably tell, my feelings towards the education system are struggling at the moment to believe that it's the best thing right now. But when I look at the alternatives, when I look at things like homeschooling, which I think could potentially offer a much broader sense of education for my child at least, there are some challenges that come up with that. So one is obviously financial and being able to put the time into homeschooling your child when you also have to have a full-time job in order to pay all of the bills. There is the challenges between what you would and wouldn't teach. You would basically have to have a second job as a teacher. And then there's also then how my child would fit back into mainstream education if they ever needed or wanted to. How you would be able to take a child from a homeschooling environment and then put them back into learning A levels or going to university without that framework that is expected within modern society and modern education that they would fit into. So if I homeschooled and we always learnt while walking, and then I chucked my child back into A level education, they were expected to sit down for 8 hours a day, then that probably wouldn't work. So I think that is also a challenge for, even if you could solve one of these individual parts, how could you create a structure where you could almost take each individual part, but it would still fit into the main until you manage to solve all of these different problems? Would it be detrimental for my child if he didn't get GCSEs and A levels when he went into the working world? And I think at the moment it would still be detrimental. It is still detrimental for people who don't have a degree, even if that degree is in a subject that's not related to the area that they're trying to go into in the working environment. And I had a quick look at Steiner schools or Waldorf schools. And I think on the whole, they definitely follow more of the philosophy that I would agree with in terms of their holistic development. They aim to encourage children's artistic and creative sides with practical skills thrown in as well. I saw on one website that they taught blacksmithing, which I thought was incredible. And they lean into imagination and creativity. They don't teach what you would consider academic subjects until much later, which I think probably works more with the developmental stages of children's brains and the way that they work. They also tend to focus that kind of learning through your child's natural curiosity and engagement in a topic. So you learn through the topic rather than it being something that you need to learn on its own in the abstract. And they also encourage empathy and cooperation and social skills, which I think is really important and is probably overlooked within the national curriculum. I think being a private school and being a different private school, there's some issues with academic rigor and the way that each school is very different and independent. There's a lack of standardization, which could lead to fluctuations in the education level that your child was getting, depending on which school they went to. And there is some weirdness that I can't quite get to the bottom of with my Google searching around the guy that created it and some of the beliefs that he held, which are no longer really applicable to society or have been disproven. Now, the website that I was looking at, which was reasonably close to us, actually addressed those issues in its Q&A and said that although it was the system was developed by this person, obviously things have moved on and some of his views are no longer legitimate and they don't really pay attention to those parts, but it's just the framework that they guide by. So again, I think that would depend on the school. And then also my exposure to these kind of schools came from Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Revenge of the Tipping Point, where he was referencing them in regards to local area variation and anti-vax movements, which were more prevalent within this school or within these schools, even if the schools were different. And I can understand where that narrative would have come from, given that these schools are developed and designed to be a more questioning environment. And so the parents and children who go to those schools probably follow some of that questioning stuff when it comes to mainstream medicine, which could then lead to the idea that vaccines aren't as important as the rest of society believes that they are, and I personally believe that they are. But I think it's difficult to tar everything with the same brush of that example, even though it would be something that would be more challenging to push against if everybody within a certain community felt a certain way. And I was quite sold on this idea and these types of schools on the whole. And then I remembered that they're private schools. And in our area, it was somewhere between £3,000 and £4,000 per term to send your child to that school. So every year you would be paying about £12,000 in order to give your child that kind of education. And so it just makes it completely inaccessible to the mainstream. Even though they sometimes have bursaries or you can potentially do some work for the school in order for funding reduction, that is still a huge amount of money when the alternative is that it's basically free education from the government and also free childcare for 5 days a week, which is obviously needed because the corporate world expects people to be working and not looking after their children after they're past a certain age. There's also something that keeps sticking in my head about the fact that different countries start the education of their children at different ages. I think in the UK we start them at, some of them are only just 4 when they start reception. And that's so young to be putting a child into an education setting. Whereas some other countries start the formal education at more like 6 or 7, which feels much more fitting for their developmental needs. So I think if I was going to start from scratch and design an education system for modern day, I would probably try and focus on the things that I thought children needed in order to thrive in modern day life. I would make sure that learning was only applied once all of their basic needs were met, including food, drink, rest, movement, so they were primed and ready to learn in a way that was suited for them. I would focus on teaching children how to learn, to follow their instincts and their passions, to then retain and present that information, but also be innovative and creative about not just taking words off the page, but also developing their own understanding of that thing in order to deliver that information in a way that made sense for them and their brains. There's this lovely idea that I learned about through Dr. K's meditation guide around the difference between knowledge and understanding. And the basic premise is that knowledge is something that you could write down, anybody could look at and ingest. But understanding is an internal thing. It is always the individual and it's always subjective. And you can only teach knowledge. Understanding has to come from within. You can only show someone the information. They have to learn how to understand it. And I think applying that premise to the way that children learn could be monumental in the way that it shifts the way that a child understands and retains and absorbs and internalizes those ideas. There's potentially something that could be done with clubs and communities that fostered this idea. So potentially not using the education system, but as a bolt on to the education system where we teach our children different life skills that we have through learning and through play, but outside of the education system using clubs and other avenues in a kind of safe but productive way. So make the parents more involved in the child's education and understanding, which could potentially, without radicalizing the education system, but potentially bolt on and learn those skills, those meditation, introspection, emotional regulation skills. But then adults would have to know how to do those things first, which I think would be a challenge in its own right. Maybe actually you could create an education which was for both children and parents to learn together. And then the child would understand that even adults don't know everything and have to learn things alongside them. And also, it would be a bonding experience for both adult and child in learning something together. I also really like the idea, if it was possible, of creating a more flexible teaching model that engaged children on their terms and not on ours. So leaning into a child's natural aptitude for certain things and going to them to enable them to learn and thrive in a way that works for them, rather than expecting everybody to fit into a standard mold. I'd love for education in the future to be more focused towards curiosity and adaptability and imagination in a way that fostered that deeper level of understanding. And also not having children who are seen but not heard. We've moved on from that as a society now. I think children should be able to ask critical questions, to challenge things, the way that they're learning, what they're learning, in a way that I'm not sure we really foster in the school system, because it makes teaching more difficult. And the teachers are already stretched and challenged enough with the restraints that they have without also being challenged by 30 kids who think that you should be explaining something differently. I definitely wouldn't be a teacher. So I guess in conclusion of this episode, I would probably ask you, how did you find education? How do you find the education that you're now putting your children through if you have children? What kind of legacy has that left on you, for better or worse? And if you were to go back and redesign your childhood education, what would you change now, knowing what you know about yourself as an adult? I think it's okay for us to say that the education system is absolutely doing the best it can right now, and still say that it's potentially not fit for purpose, and that there is loads more that we could do to make it better, to allow our children to thrive and grow and develop into the kind of people who can both challenge the modern way of thinking and be disruptive and innovative in new and amazing ways that we have never even considered, while holding on to some of those core values of the idea that every child deserves an education. Every child needs to learn some core skills in order to survive and thrive within the modern world. I guess the biggest question would be, what kind of world could we create if we used education to unlock every child's natural and unbound potential, instead of potentially boxing them up into certain categories and leaving them with a legacy of misunderstanding of themselves and their ability? I think it'd be a pretty incredible place. And I really hope that my kids can grow up with an understanding and an education and those key skills. And if education could be part of that, then the education system could be part of that, then that would be an incredible thing to see. So with that, I'll leave you for today. I would love to hear your thoughts on the subject and to understand your opinions. As always, I am always eager to hear other people's views on these kind of topics, to challenge my way of thinking and potentially give me extra insights that I can incorporate into my general view on things to make it more nuanced and more balanced and have a deeper understanding of every subject. So with that, have a lovely day, everybody. Take care.